All right. Okay, so as I was saying, I think I know a good portion of you, but not quite everybody. So first of all, thank you all. It's very humbling to have so many people be interested in this class. That's kind of something I'm pretty passionate about. And yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing what I know with you guys. Just kind of a show of hands, how many people are programmers in here? Programmers, okay. Artists, designers? Sweet. Other? Cool. So we've got a producer for the project, all right.
That would be, I'm not even a producer, but.
Game designer.
Can we edit that out to 9 seconds?
9-second delay?
Yeah.
Right, okay. So a little bit about my background, just so you know kind of where I'm coming from. I studied video game design formally at USC and worked at electronic arts a little bit. Worked on MMORPGs there on Dark Age of Camelot and stuff like that. Then after that, I did some contracting work for Konami and some other companies and built some iPhone games for them and things along those lines. My interests have a lot to do especially with serious games, and which is essentially how games can be applied to doing social good or to other topics than just kind of pure entertainment. So we'll touch on that a little bit and kind of why video games might be suited for that. But as I've been kind of saying in the introduction and everything, this first class is really intended to be psychology. It's intended to be looking at the driving motivation behind video games, what's the different sorts of research that's going into the field of video games right now, because it's incredibly interdisciplinary. There's a lot of different moving parts that come into it. I mean, game theory is not a video game concept. Game theory is an economics concept. So it's something that's used in game design, is very fundamental to it, and yet is from this completely disparate field of economics and human psychology and all that sort of stuff. So, if you guys haven't seen this book, it's called Reality is Broken. We have it here at the office. It's very, very good. I highly recommend it, by Jane McGonigal. She makes a lot of really interesting points in it, but basically she's saying that games aren't exactly what we tend to think that they are. People have this kind of perception that games are this non-thing, this just purely entertaining thing that you do in free times and serve no value to society. And she makes a really strong case that that's not the case. One of her quotes I really like is, "The opposite of play isn't work, it's depression." Kind of an interesting way to think about it, because when you're playing, it doesn't mean that you're not accomplishing something. So serious games. These are interesting examples. Does anybody recognize some of the things on the screen here?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, okay. Yeah. I think that's
the language game, I forget the name of it.
Yeah, the one on the upper left is Duolingo, which is really cool. Actually, the story behind that's really interesting. Are you guys familiar with the CAPTCHA? Those little weird text things on the web that you have to like input the text in or whatever to get past to prove that you're human. Same guy who invented that invented Duolingo. And Duolingo is a language learning game where you earn points and level up in different languages and whatnot, but it's completely free. And the reason that it is free is because as you get to a higher level, they actually start giving you untranslated sentences from around the internet. And they're essentially crowdsourcing the idea of translating untranslatable stuff by having already taught you to be good at that language. It's really kind of a virtuous cycle. One of my favorite examples of just an awesome usage of video games and also kind of wasted human potential. This is the guy who invented it. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he's really obsessed with this idea of like wasted human potential. The reCAPTCHA, for example, if you've ever seen the two of them side by side, they're translating books. Like one of them, you don't know which, but one of them is I'm sorry, not translating, but transcribing books. One's a un-OCR-able bit of text. Yeah. Fold it. Did anybody hear about this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? You want to
Protein folding.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fucking awesome.
Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, so people like designed a game so people can try to represent, I don't know if you guys know too much about genes and stuff, but basically when you have a protein sequence, it folds up into this very, very, very hard to predict stage, which is called the tertiary representation. And they basically got people to like play with these and come up with these just complex ways that proteins actually fold in real life. So it's a huge part of bioinformatics is figuring out how to go from what the first level, which is just the ACGT sequence is, to what that looks like in real life in terms of like a 3D. They're basically like little machines.
Yeah. I know nothing about the genome side there, any of that sort of stuff, but the press headline, which was really cool, was essentially that gamers had solved this problem that had been a huge problem for a number of years and kind of cracked a major sticking point for attacking a certain disease or something along those lines. Probably horribly garbling with vocabulary.
Yeah.
But yeah, in a matter of a couple of days with this game going online, by turning what was this really hard problem into an effective game, they, again, crowdsourced the intellectual capacity to figure it out and helped humanity, so to speak. And the last example on the far right there is actually from USC. It's a project that was going on while I was there that's called Full Spectrum Warrior. And it's part of a number of different projects that was used to help train different recruits and such in the military, especially for things like a number of different facets, but like how to be acclimated to their local culture. Like it would penalize you if you didn't take off your sunglasses before you tried to talk to somebody in the Iraqi desert or something like that. So interesting, pretty wide spectrum of what games can be used for. All right, so it's enough about serious games for the moment, but let's talk about gamification. Everybody's probably heard of this phrase, gamification, right? It's this notion that we're going to take game mechanics and we're going to slap them on to whatever else. We're going to put stars on it, we're going to put ranks on it, we're going to put, whatever, and all of a sudden we're going to have something fun. I think there's been kind of a pushback recently against the notion of gamification because, in my opinion, you end up with essentially franking games. This sort of situation where you've got a motivation over here and a set of game design principles over here, and you just kind of mash them together. And what comes out ends up being something that's like, do work, do work, do work, now get some stars. Do work, do work, do work, now some weird little reward. It's not really a game so much as it is just kind of a hybrid of two things that don't really make sense together. So with that, that's kind of the motivation for talking about this class and kind of doing away with this notion of gamification as a afterthought. Game design has to be something that you think of from the ground up, from the beginning. It is something that is intrinsic to the product that you're building. I mean, here we all build pretty cool products, and we think a lot about users' experience and things along those lines. So I think we're pretty used to thinking in these terms already. So the greatest thing about video games, in my opinion, is that they are implicitly, intrinsically motivated. So if you haven't heard of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation is when I say, if you do this, I'll give you $5. And we used to think that that was really effective. We used to think that was an awesome tool for getting people to do things. Turns out, not so good. Turns out it's only good for simple, like, motor tasks, essentially. If somebody can, if they're putting a part together or something just repeatedly, pay them more and they might work a little bit harder. But you're not going to get more intellectual creativity out of somebody. You're not going to get more high quality thought process or work from extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation, on the other hand, has a lot of extra just value. Does anybody know what ego depletion is?
Yeah. So basically, the more decisions that you make, or the more you refuse to do something that you want, the less ability you have to keep not doing what you want. So there are all these different studies that have proved that ego depletion is a real thing. So judges being lenient or not lenient changes throughout the day based on how many cases they've already had to make calls on.
Yeah.
And so yeah, basically the more decisions, the more hard decisions that you have to make, the less able you are to make those hard calls.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The first study, I think, was one that had to do with what the participants thought was the study was not actually the variable. The variable was the fact that either put a plate of really warm cookies or a plate of I don't know, some vegetable on the table before the study, and then they watched how long the person was willing to do an impossible task, which was what they thought was the study. So what they found was that by resisting the smell and those warm cookies out there, people were less able to spend time on the task. So really interesting concept. It applies to judges. It applies all over the place. But one of the great things about intrinsic motivation, among many things, is that it's not ego depleting. So this touches on some of the very, very basic psychology. Why can you sit and play a game, or at least I can sit and play a game, I don't know about you guys, for like way too many hours. Like until it's 4 in the morning, you're like, you're sleep deprived, and you're sitting there, you're going, well, crap, I should feel tired right now, and I didn't even feel tired. That is the intrinsic motivation coming out. So let's talk a little bit about breaking down games to their core part. Did anybody ever read the book? It's fairly recent, called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. No? Okay. Well, I shamelessly stole this graphic from him. It is his representation of the habit loop. Basically, his thesis here is that all habits have a cue, a routine, and a reward. And your brain is very, very simple. Something happens that triggers you to think, or not even necessarily think, but your brain to spontaneously bubble up what your habit is. And then afterwards you get a reward, and they feed back into each other. It creates a cycle that becomes more and more reinforcing. If anybody's ever studied neuroscience, you may have heard the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. Yeah. It's the same sort of idea here. Habits are exactly that. Your brain associates the reward with the trigger, which then causes you want to do the routine again. And then every time, it just gets more and more reinforced. So that basic psychological principle starts to build on itself in such a way that you can see why games in particular are habit-inducing. Or anything, really, can be habit-inducing, but games leverage this very interestingly. So next, another interesting book is called Hooked by Mir Yal. It's the same basic idea, but he's showing how this applies to products. You have a trigger, you have an action, you have a variable reward, and then you invest back into it again. He's just essentially making the same case for this sort of habit loop as it applies to constructed products. So in video games, this is what we call the core loop. Anybody play Clash of Clans?
That game.
You hate that game? Because it's too addictive, or just you just hate it?
You don't get anywhere.
Mm.
It works very well for students.
Well, it's addictive, yeah.
It's addictive, yeah. Yeah, anybody else play it? Yeah?
I do.
Do you hate it, love it?
I hate it. I hate it. I've been playing for like a year, but I refuse to pay any money, so I move very slowly. So I just
Okay.
log on like once a day.
Yeah.
I click some stuff and then I close it. I don't know why. I don't even enjoy it. Like
Right there, you open it, you click some stuff, you close it, you don't know why. Look at this graphic on the screen. That is the core loop right there. That is the habit-inducing loop that they have got you into. And here it is. There's a time delay. You fire up the application, you collect resources, and it's like stars and banners and a little dopamine surge in your brain, and it feels great for a second. And you might use those resources to build and train something. And then, you start all over again. You close the application, and you didn't even have to do much of anything, but there were some pretty graphics, and you did the little actions that it told you should do, and all of a sudden you feel ever so slightly rewarded. I had a friend in our game design curriculum who used to joke that we are drug dealers in the video game design business, and what we're selling is dopamine. And we're selling it in the form of these little hits at the end of each core loop. So that's what you're trying to get the user to, that little dopamine surge at the end of the core loop that signifies reward, that signifies accomplishment and progression. And each time that loop runs, it's going to be something that becomes more and more significant in their mind. So we'll get to that in just a second. How does the core loop build upon itself? Flow. Anybody heard of this concept? Yeah?
So it was I've heard of the game.
Oh, you've heard of the game, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know that there's a concept behind it, but I don't actually know the concept.
Okay. Does anybody else know it, or shall I explain? Oh, okay. Yeah.
I forget the Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. It's
Yeah,
like
nice
psychologist.
pronunciation.
I guess he's basically just got this idea that when you're doing something that's not too hard but not too easy, you sort of enter this state of like, kind of, sort of like you're talking about with games, you kind of zone out a little bit, like you feel like you're not as aware of time passing, and that's kind of the ideal state to be in to do sort of fun, enjoyable work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that's perfect. If you look at this graph here, it points to the notion that if the challenge were too high before your ability were high enough, it would cause anxiety. But if the challenge is too low and your ability is too high, then it causes boredom. So there's this channel, and that channel is what we call the zone. It's what we call getting lost in the game, or it's not just games, it's anything. He showed that people across all walks of life in all different places can experience this psychological element of flow. Csikszentmihalyi did his original work in, I think, the 80s, and it was pretty revolutionary at the time. He studied people from welders, I think, to CEOs, to just, it's one of those things that transcends everything. It cuts the heart of what is pleasurable as a human to kind of engage in. And flow really touches on that, and he calls it the psychology of optimal experience, which kind of speaks a lot to what it might accomplish for us. Like, optimal experience, the best experience you can have. That's a pretty lofty thing to shoot for. So, a couple thoughts about that. The game Flow was created by Genova Chen, actually, another USC person that was doing his master's thesis there, and he took this psychological concept of flow and applied it to video game design. And some of the work that he did had to do with this notion of dynamic difficulty adjustment. So to try to keep you in that little trench there, he would react to your advancements and your failures by tweaking the difficulty of the game. If you got a little too hard, you drop it down a little bit without you even noticing. And as a result, you kind of always stayed in that nice little channel. It always felt appropriately difficult. It's pretty interesting. And it also was very, as you might be able to glean from the graphic there, it's very flowy feeling and kind of ambient noise. And I highly recommend checking it out. It's a Flash game. It's probably still online if you have some time to go look at it. He then went on to found a company called That Game Company. They're doing pretty well. So, pretty cool stuff. One of the most interesting things that, to me, that actually was statistic in Reality is Broken, that book that I showed in the beginning by Jane McGonigal, is video games that they did a study of some of the most popular video games out there. Who played Flappy Bird? Yeah?
Missed the window.
Missed the window? Only a few people played Flappy Bird in this room, right? Yeah? How often, how frustrating was Flappy Bird?
Pretty frustrating.
Pretty frustrating?
Yeah.
So it falls into a genre sometimes called the masocore genre, but it's indicative of this larger trend, which is actually that of the really popular games, people tend to spend about 80% of their time failing. Straight up failing, which is, to me, fascinating. Like, why is that so pleasurable? Why do we want to design games? I'm not saying that your game has to make people fail all the time, or that you should create a massive core game, or that you should make it incredibly frustrating. But why is it that humans are so interested in that act of not succeeding? So we'll get back to that a little bit later. But just kind of returning to this notion of flow and core loops here. Now that we put these two things together, we start to see some understanding of how everything works together. In the game, we segment these core loops into blocks, and those blocks move us through a channel of flow. So you might have different worlds in your game, and each one you progress through represents a core loop. It represents a gameplay session. And then the person might leave the game and come back a day later. And then they play World 2, and they play World 3. And through this time, they're experiencing a sense of progress. They're moving through your game. They're seeing the different levels. And what's carrying them through this is the motivation, the rewards, that intrinsic motivation we're talking about. And also, this notion of the keeping an eye on the end goal. Like, there's always got to be something out there that's like, level 10. I'm going to go get to be level 10 someday. So that's kind of how the internals of a game are structured, to keep people interested, to keep them engaged, and how you use the core loop and flow. Before we move on, anybody have any questions or thoughts about that? Yeah.
I think it's interesting how many games, like, there really is no, like, success. Like Tetris, like, you can't beat Tetris. Or...
Incidentally, it's another massive core game.
Not hardcore enough, I guess.
Yeah. No, I find that fascinating too, that those are always the games that attract me the most as well, the games where there is no clear, like, this is where it ends. Because that feels like I don't know, it feels disheartening to a certain degree, to me.
Love Clash of Clans is what you're...
I stopped playing Clash of Clans very intentionally because I knew that I wouldn't be able to stop if I didn't.
Yeah, I had to delete it from everywhere.
From everywhere.
Yeah, from everywhere, yeah. Yeah. Well, there's, I personally, the reason I left the game industry was because I got to the point where I got too analytical with games too, where I'd sit there and like not be enjoying it. I just be like, ooh, look what they did here. Like look at this mechanic that they used. So I have a harder time engaging with them now too. Yeah. Any other thoughts about core loop? Yeah.
Is there a notion of like hierarchy of loops where you have like a larger loop and that loop has many like smaller, like shorter time period loops, I guess?
Yeah, certainly. You're definitely you're touching on something that is absolutely part of like more complicated game design. What you might see in this example here is that these worlds might then, okay, like, what are some examples? Actually, I'm working on a game right now that I'm doing exactly that with, which is each gameplay session is intended to be about an 8-minute gameplay session, and it's one battle that you engage in. And there's a core loop in that because they each has turns in the battle. So they're kind of stacked on each other, where you're feeling good for each turn that you complete. I wouldn't quite call that a core loop. The entire battle is a core loop, where you might win or lose against the enemy. But then there's another part of it that has to hook it back into the meta game. And this is the recent game design challenge that I was actually struggling with, is that after you win, you might just be given, like, hey, look, here's your loot. Well, now what? Just play again? That's not very interesting. Like, there's no imperative to do anything at that point. So you need something else to start hooking it together. So you might have a small mini loop, and then each one of those might connect into a larger loop that shows you as your player's rank is improving, you're getting involved in the meta community. But in my experience, and I could be completely wrong with this, more than 2 becomes cumbersome. Because like one small and one big makes sense. I do my little actions, and then they tie into a bigger action. But so like in the example of my game, the big loop is about deck building. It's about putting together like the best army in the world. But the little loop is about winning each battle. Looks like you had something else to say for a second. Okay. Anything else? All right, move on then.
Real though, can you beat Tetris though?
I don't know.
I think you can. No?
You can win by finishing each level. And you can like basically play forever. I mean, I guess that's what you mean. But I think you can win.
Are you talking about Tetris?
And the logic equation,
Tetris, you go to the next level of Tetris.
Fun level. I mean, that might be an interesting example right there, is make a meta game out of Tetris. Like, each thing that you did or did not succeed turns into a little building that you turn into like a larger game of some sort. I mean, it could be an interesting idea.
Pac-Man, when you finish it, it actually crashes. Is that winning?
Because nobody ever got there, so nobody was able to test the edge case.
A lot of people got there.
Wikipedia's got something to say on it.
Ooh, what does Wikipedia say?
There's a possibility
No, yeah,
of
he's
infinite gameplay section.
You know your game is hard if the win scenario is an edge case. There's a programmer joke for you. Okay, Prisoner's Dilemma. So does anybody listen to Radiolab podcast? Did you guys hear the one with the game show recently, the Golden Balls?
Yeah.
Can you relate what happened in the podcast?
Well, that was cute.
Yeah,
That was
it was a
really
good
fun.
podcast.
It's a British game show where at the end, two people face off against each other, and they have two balls. One that says, it's like betray or split. And they have to pick one or the other. And if they both pick betray, they don't get any prize money. If only one of them picks betray, that person gets all the prize money. But if both of them pick split, then they get to split the money. So then they have to negotiate with each other and talk to each other in order to figure out what they're going to pick. And it's like really heart-wrenching. It's like really bad. Yeah, you should listen to it. It's really good.
Yeah, does that make sense to everybody? Like, as it was described, the two different balls, the betray and split balls? Yeah? So this is this is the heart of the prisoner's dilemma. It's essentially a TV game show form of the exact same problem that is known in economics and game theory and kind of seen all over the place. There's a Dilbert comic if people so choose to actually read that. Okay, right. I googled prisoner's dilemma, and that's what came up. This also came up, which is one of the more kind of animated standard representations of the problem as you see it, which is that you have two people, and essentially the way it's formally stated is that, so we've been saying prisoner's dilemma. I didn't explain where this whole terminology of prisoners and dilemma came from. So imagine that you have two people that got arrested, and they are compatriots in some act. They both robbed a bank or some such. And the police officers have them in two different interrogation rooms. And they're doing the whole good cop, bad cop thing in front of them. They're yelling in their faces, and they're saying, you got to betray your friend, blah, 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 blah. They offer them deals, right? You can betray your friend, or you cannot betray your friend. Now, if you betray your friend, let's see. It's always hard for me to exactly remember this. You betray your friend, and he does not betray you, you go free. You cut a deal. And of course the opposite is true, which is that if he betrays you, but you don't betray him, not only do you go to jail, but you get a full 5 years. Now, on the other hand, if you both betray each other, you get, I believe it's 3 years. The formulation differs a little bit, but the notion is essentially that if you both betray, the quote-unquote rewards in game parlance are really bad, and if you both protect each other, the rewards, quote-unquote, are very good. So, factually, whenever you look at this problem, the truthful answer is that being loyal to each other is the best solution. It's supposed to be. That's the way the problem is formulated. However, human psychology is such that the correct solution, what you should do, is essentially always betray your friend. It's weird because when you line up these different rewards in such a way, I think the different mathematical formulations can make it more or less clear, but if you look at if you just break down every scenario, it ends up making more mathematical sense, essentially to betray your friend. So it's kind of the nature of the problem. So if we look at this in terms of what you would do to build a game around it, I actually stole this from a blog post on blog.wolffire.com. I thought he did a good job of taking the prisoner's dilemma and showing how it starts to interact with gameplay. He described this game of building rabbits and building wolves. So, I'm sorry, I always have a hard time explaining the prisoner's dilemma, so if anybody wants to jump in here and give me a hand, that'd be much appreciated. But essentially, you can either build a rabbit in your turn, or you can build a wolf in your turn. Now, the wolf always beats rabbit, can always eat the rabbit, right? But if you both build rabbits, the rewards are very high. So what the prisoner's dilemma here, or the wolf-rabbit game, breaks down to is if you can be sure that you can convince your friend to both build rabbits, then that's going to be the best solution. It's going to give you both the highest rewards. But because of the uncertainty, because of the method of human nature, the best gameplay strategy ends up being to build wolves. And what happens is, if you do this with people, if people know this intuitively, people will start building wolves quite quickly in this sort of scenario. And as a result, it's essentially a broken game. So how do we fix it? Wolves, rabbits, and rats. We add a third variable in here. Now, instead of having just rabbits and wolves, we have a third animal, and we create a triangle of what trumps what. And pretty quickly we realized that this is rock, paper, scissors. So instead of one being categorically better than the other, aka wolves eating rats, the three of them now are in a situation where, okay, the wolf eats the rabbit, the rat beats the wolf, and the rabbit beats the rat. So in that scenario, just like rock, paper, scissors, there is no best move. There is no categorical, this is what you should do. In fact, it's based a lot on just trying to guess what your opponent's going to do. Now we have a fun game, to some extent. Maybe not the most fun game, but a more fun game than one with just rabbits and wolves, where everybody builds wolves. Does that description kind of make sense? Okay, cool. So how it relates to games, well, we saw this kind of build-up of how you turn the basic prisoner's dilemma into an actual game structure. But there's also the notion of what's interesting about this is that players are reward maximizing agents. The basic assumption of game theory in economics and in gameplay design is that players want to have the best outcome for themselves. That's what we mean by reward maximizing. So when you play chess, you're playing chess to win, presumably. Nobody plays chess to lose. So game rules exist to constrain those actions. Game rules exist to give you a structure by which you can attempt to maximize your reward. And particularly when you have multiple players, game rules dictate how you can interact with each other and how the game interacts with itself. So the prisoner's dilemma and building upon it is perhaps the most simple, stripped down version of what ultimately describes human psychology and attempting to beat each other or beat the system within games. Because it's not always A versus B. It might be A and B versus the rules. There are games in which you're collectively trying to beat the game itself. But nonetheless, the same basic principles apply. So, okay, before we move on to pretty much the last major part, does anybody have any questions about that stuff? Cool. So, there are lots of different ways to break down games and deconstruct them into different parts. The structure I was taught is the one I'm about to present here. I find that a lot of different deconstruction techniques are kind of variations on the same theme. The structure is that of formal, dramatic, and dynamic elements. So, again, that's formal, dramatic, and dynamic. If we look at chess, it is a game which is 95% formal, in the sense that it is a very rule-bound game. To the extent that there are dramatic elements in chess, it's this very thin veneer of the queens and the kings and things like that. There's very little, shall we say, artistic flair or storyline or back history or anything along those lines. There's no cinematics in chess. So it's a highly structured, highly formal game. You might even be able to say that checkers is even further. There's 2 colors. So it's getting even more towards the formal. Dynamic is essentially how the rules interact with each other and how the player interacts with the rules. So, and this is touching back to our notion of the prisoner's dilemma. Players, you start to realize really quickly, derive joy from exploiting rules. That nobody likes, well, I wouldn't say nobody, but it's rare that somebody just sits there and says, look, I'm doing exactly what I'm told. That's a tutorial. Games come about from being able to say, like, I think maybe if I tweak this, if I do this with my player, if I turn this piece sideways in Tetris, if I do, this little thing that maybe nobody has thought of before, maybe then I can beat it. Maybe then I can. There's this kind of perverse joy out of almost breaking the game. And that's the dynamic. That's the way things interact with each other. That's power-ups, for example, are dynamic elements. You might get a power-up that makes you invincible for a short period of time, which leads to all different things that essentially the game designer couldn't predict. And this is why I find dynamic to be the most interesting of the 3, and also the part that you have to just test and experiment with and kind of figure out what's going on in your game. It's something that you won't know it's broken until you see it, until you realize that that person was invincible and just ran through your boss. So that it's kind of tricky in that sense. And the last part is dramatic, which are essentially the aesthetics. The way I like to think of dramatic elements or aesthetic elements in the game is that they're a force multiplier on all of the rest of the work you do. So if you have a good game in its core mechanic, the dramatic that you add on top of it will make it way more fun. All of a sudden, all those sounds and those pretty stars and everything are just going to make people love it. But a veneer of nice aesthetics on top of a crappy game design, not so great.
What do you say about like slot machines and things like that? It's literally not even a game.
Yeah,
Wildly popular.
Why are they popular?
Yeah, I know, wildly popular.
Mm.
You compare it to something like chess with no, real aesthetics to it, all strategy game. I bet there are more slot machine people than chess players.
That's an interesting point. I would say that slot machine as a game design, it's hard for me even to call it like really game design because it's really just a random roll. Like there's no game design element to this. I'm sure other people might have better takes on this. I haven't really thought about this before, but my gut reaction is that you're just reacting to the element of chance. If you build a game that's 100% chance, like classically we think of things like Sorry and Go, or not Go, but Sorry is a game, or Chutes and Ladders, of huge amounts of chance. Now, tangentially, that's used a lot of times with games targeted at children because it's a equalizer when chance is such a big part and skill doesn't have the ability to like make one player dominant over the other. Yeah, I guess as it pertains to slot machines, just kind of dopamine hit after dopamine hit, being like, I hope I win, I hope I win.
Can I throw something in there?
Yeah.
It was kind of like, what was your name again?
Dave.
Dave, like Dave said. I think that kind of also has like that inner and outer loop. The inner loop is just each game, and when you win, you get a big dopamine rush.
Yeah.
And then the outer circle is like, are you going to be up at the end of the night? So you're like trying to maximize where you're going with these little like dopamine hits along the way.
And a lot of casinos have actually started implementing some like rather sophisticated analytics such that if it seems like you've been playing for a long time and you haven't won, they will like force the slot machine to like give you a payout so that you stay.
So that's like adjusting the flow thing.
Yeah, definitely a little difficulty adjusting it. So they are making them into games despite the chance.
Have you guys heard of the concept of Skinner boxes?
No.
so Skinner boxes. There was a researcher whose last name was Skinner, who was researching like rat psychology, and what he found was that every time that a rat, if he could put like a bottle of sugar water, which the rats want because it's sweet. If he put a lever where the rat could just hit the lever, get the sugar water, and be happy, the rat would like hit it until it was done.
Yeah.
And then hit it until it was like tired of having sugar water, and then it would go away. But if he made it so that sometimes when you hit the lever, it would dispense sugar water, and sometimes when you hit the lever, it wouldn't dispense sugar water, the rats got super addicted and just would hit the lever all day and would never stop. Or like basically never stop. Like they'd stop to like sleep, and like that's probably it.
Yeah.
And so that sometimes gets talked about in terms of like abusive game design, because it's like it's inherently like addictive. And the point of it is to like make someone do something that they don't want to do. And it's not that it's like a fun thing to do. It's just that like you gotta do it.
Yeah, that addiction. I mean, there's definitely good and bad, and can be used for good and evil sort of situation. Yeah.
Yeah, apparently they found that with LED technology, when it first came out of it, that it actually makes certain neurons fire just by construction, just kind of coincidentally. And so there's definitely like a hacking of neurons thing going on. And like I was going to talk about like now with cell phones that you literally hold right here, that is like even more so.
Yeah, gambling's an interesting facet of game design, which is a big field of study. I just personally haven't looked into it a whole lot. It just doesn't particularly, like, it's not my field of interest, but I think it is fascinating because there's this additional notion of money being on the line that kind of puts something else into it in people's minds, which I don't quite get. I mean, like, I'm always whenever I play poker or whatever, I'm always kind of like, okay, I got my $10 that I'm playing with, and I don't want to go beyond that. You know, if I'm out, I'm out, sort of thing. So, yeah. I guess last thing I was going to say about this formal, dramatic, and dynamic is when I used to do game hackathons, what we would do is have a team where, of course, we all communicated and such, but the game would be built with the programmers and the designers literally building with balls and sticks. Like, intentionally using the worst art we could create. The worst. And the point was that if we can make it fun while we're doing this, then when the artists come in at the 11th hour and drop us all these assets and we replace them, it's going to be a lot of fun. And it was a very, very effective technique. Because you focus on the formal and the dynamic, the heart of the game design, and then you layer on those aesthetics. Now, that being said, you can't have the two be completely out of sync. I mean, if you had I don't know, maybe a first-person shooter with like unicorns and candy would be kind of fun. But my point is simply that you could do it wrong. You could be in a situation where you took dramatic elements and aesthetics and layered them in a place where they didn't make sense. So you do have to be conscientious. The more in sync and in harmony they are with each other, the more the game is going to feel cohesive in the end. It might still be fun without it because the mechanics still work, but the game will feel more honest, I guess, if these aesthetic elements fit with the formal and dynamic elements. All right. So, kind of taking it back, and a question that maybe we should have started with, but what are the different types or genres of games that people can think of? Just shout them out. MMO, okay. Which, the full name being MMORPG, and RPG is its own thing too, right? Yeah. So does everybody know what MMOs and RPGs are?
I know RPG, but not MMO.
MMO is massively multiplayer online.
Okay.
So,
All the fun.
Right.
MMORPG.
So, when you take all of those people and put them all together in one spot. World of Warcraft. Anybody else?
Isn't there like some distinction between there are like turn-based games and sort of like non-turn-based games? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can cut them down. Like, I'm not saying, like, I don't have a classification system I'm trying to teach you right here or anything like that. Yeah, like, you can have turn-based games, you can have real-time games, real-time strategy, for example, as opposed to turn-based strategy, where real-time strategy is like Warcraft or something like that, or StarCraft. Turn-based strategy will be, you know, go back and forth.
Puzzles.
Puzzles, yeah, puzzle games. What else?
I mean, in general, you kind of stole it, but there's like logic games versus like probability games, like some like a slot machine, right? Like there's no skill, right? But like chess or like Go, it's like 100% skill. Like there's no probability you're gonna win if you suck and you're playing somebody who's really good. Like you fucking lose.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. And like we were talking about a second ago, a lot of times it exists on a spectrum from skill to randomness. And game designers will think about randomness very intentionally. I might use randomness in order to mitigate skill when I know that two mismatched opponents are against each other. Like if I know that, you know, just objectively you're rank 5 and I'm rank 2, I might essentially handicap you by inserting more randomness. And it becomes kind of a transparent way of balancing the game a little bit between us.
Sandbox.
Sandbox, yeah, open world sort of stuff. The sort of game that everybody loves to kind of like stick the sandbox label on it. You know, go explore and do any quests and, you know, all that sort of stuff. But
So what is that? I'm not familiar with that term.
I think GTA would probably, Grand Theft Auto would probably be one of the like quintessential examples. What would you say are the defining characters?
Yeah, I think Grand Theft Auto is like the defining one. I mean, you could call like Skyrim a sandbox or open world, or like other ones.
You do like Minecraft probably too, right?
Yeah, Minecraft.
Yeah, absolutely. So like the notion that there is no end to it and that anything can be done kind of thing. Like a sandbox, like you can build whatever you want to build. It's completely up to you.
According to your classifications, it'd be like the ultimate like dynamic, I guess.
Yeah.
In the sense it's all about breaking the rules.
Right, exactly. Like you've got these pieces, like Minecraft is practically built out of atoms. Like, and then you figure out how you put those atoms together, and who knows what you're going to build. Yeah. Any other genres of games?
What about like social games, like drinking games?
Okay. Yeah, well, there's drinking games. That's certainly
There's a lot of games that like, sort of like slots. There's no strategy or anything, but because they're all sitting there together and it's like occupying you, or whatever. Board games, sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Strategy and drinking games? I don't know.
Those are like skill-based.
Strategy is very
Pong, quarters.
Yeah.
Quarters is like the strangest game to me because like no one like it's stupid. Like how do you win
You
quarters?
get drunk? Everybody wins at all.
Yeah, everyone wins.
Well, like, I don't know, the way we play quarters in college specifically, like there's many like first level cups and you try to get them and then like there's like the king cup that you want to get, but like all the first cups don't matter at all. It's like the outcome of the game. I don't know. Sorry.
No,
It's my anti-quarters rant.
Your rewards like
Yeah.
You got a bunch of little cups and then the final one.
Yeah, but like it's an entirely separate game, and that's like the game that actually determines the outcome of the game. And these are.
I think there's a couple more that we haven't touched on yet.
First-person shooters?
Yeah, there we go. First-person shooters, FPSs. The games that the media loves to hate so much. They're making our children violent and blah, 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 blah. Oh, my God. Don't get me started. Oh, okay. Wait, in which games?
There's like some sniper game on the iPhone, and like snipe people in the head.
Yeah.
Like it shows blood squirting.
There you go.
What about in real life? Does she shoot BB guns and stuff?
I need to get a .22 rifle. Yes, I intend to do that as well. I need to.
What would you call Angry Birds?
Angry Birds. Ooh, that's interesting. I mean, I would call it a casual game as my first instinct. I'm trying to think of like a subgenre within that to put it in.
It would be like solely skill, but like there's no strategy. It's like just physical skill or like measuring your angle or whatever.
Sure.
Isn't it kind of like a puzzle in some ways too, though?
Yeah.
Because there's like some physics in there. I don't know.
Definitely has some puzzle aspects, yeah. I think I would call it a physics puzzle, yeah. Along the same lines as the games where like you're stacking blocks. In a certain sort of way, I would say that Angry Birds has similarity to something like Jenga, in the sense that you're thinking about it from the perspective of, you know, looking at this physical structure and in this particular scenario, how do I make the move that's going to accomplish the result that I want? So social games are an interesting concept, or casual games really are an interesting concept, because they were just starting to explode when I was in college. And it was kind of blowing everybody's mind, because for the first time ever, the key demographic for casual games was 40 to 50-year-old women. And that was just like, video game industry, how do we adapt? Like, can somebody please tell me how to design for this demographic? Because there's not many of those particular people in that video game design.
Angry Birds, or what game?
Just casual games in general. So this is when, you know, Farmville and Bejeweled and things like this, or Candy Crush, all of these games are very, very predominantly women, and especially, you know, like, I think at least 30 plus, but yeah, 30 to 50, something like that, if memory serves. So it just kind of like, it took the video game industry by surprise, especially if you consider that they were also generating a lot of money for the industry. Looking inside the industry a little bit, like, we've got sports games, for example. Sports games are an amazing cash cow for companies like EA, because they do a little bit of graphics tweaking, they update the roster, and boom, they've got a new generation for a new year, and there we go, there's our new game, and everybody's going to buy it. But, I mean, not to get on a tangent, but if you ever wonder why, like, you don't see big production games that are really creative, it's essentially because the industry becomes self-reinforcing. I mean, those sorts of big games require you going out on a limb, but when you get right down to it, people like things that they essentially kind of know already. And it creates problems where, prior to the casual games and the social gaming industry coming and shaking things up and reducing costs so that smaller developers could get in, you basically had two types of games that were really dominating the industry when it came to quote-unquote AAA titles. You had like the sports games, three types. The sports games, the pre-existing like long-running titles like Mario or something like that, Zelda, and you had intellectual property IP games associated with a movie or something along those lines. So like the new Batman movie's going to come out, so we're going to go make a video game in conjunction with the Batman movie. And those are the three sorts of games that would get tons of funding, and you know they'd do well, and they could market them because people knew them. So.
What about like educational games, like learning games?
Yeah, I think learning games tend to be, as a student being, this is actually my my field of interest when I got into game design, was using it specifically for educational purposes. It tends to be a strategy within games as well. I mean, you can consider the genre. I'm not like, making a formal definition of genre here, but like I tend to think of it as you might have a first-person shooter that is educational. I don't know if you could, but maybe you found a way. Like, actually, in certain ways, that military game was exactly that. It was the U.S. military used it to educate their troops. So, yeah. There's rhythm games and things along those lines, like Rock Band and Guitar Hero, which incidentally is also my favorite example of, in my opinion, the best done educational video game ever. Guitar Hero, you don't even realize that you're learning rhythm. You don't even know it. And yet, after a few hours of playing that, studies have actually been done to show that you are significantly better at with your sense of tempo and rhythm. So, kind of interesting, in my opinion. I think that covers most of them, unless somebody else can.
How do you categorize something like SimCity, where it may not be a goal to reach, it's just really creating and building and linking things together. And my daughter would play that or Sims, or like I know there's a huge sim game about railroads, and it's just endless tracks and railroads, and it's just building this whole infrastructure. And I don't know if that's considered like a simulation game, or is it something else?
Yeah, the sim games definitely have their own kind of genre. I would say they're within the box of sandbox video games as well. Kind of open world, do what you will, here's your resources available to you sort of thing. All of this actually touches on something that I'm going to try to remember off the top of my head right now, but I'm afraid that I'm not going to get all the categories right. It's actually, there's this theory that there are essentially 4 driving psychological motivators for gamers, that they can essentially be, how do I get this right, explorers, crafters, like combatants, and like something else. There's like 4 main categories. I'll Google it afterwards and figure out what it was. But essentially that people will lean towards one or another. Like some people want to go out there and find out everything that exists in the world, see all the pretty art, just see everything. There's other people that want to build everything. They want to use their own hands to take what the game gave them and make something interesting. There's other people that want to test their skills against other things. They want to pit themselves against another player, against the system, whatever it is. And there's a 4th one that I'm just blanking on, and I always blank on. So, oh well. They're not important. Yes, socializers. That's exactly it. Have you read this before?
I took a video game course in college.
Okay, nice. Yeah, socializers value building relationships. They're the ones who build clans and guilds and things like that. Which to me is why the really big, massively multiplayer games are so fascinating, because they do try to cater to all 4 types. If anybody play Guild Wars?
Yeah.
Yeah, Guild Wars 2. Do you remember? I don't know if you had the same experience, but when I was playing it, this experience of like seeing each of the ways they cater to different people, like they have these different objectives on the map where you can discover these lookouts. I'm like, oh, this is for the explorers. And you can discover different mining points to get crafting materials. I'm like, oh, this is for the crafters. And then there's different areas that are PvP. I'm like, oh, this is for the PvP, player versus player, combatant sort of thing. Oh, this is for the combatants. And then the whole game, Guild Wars, is about building a guild and becoming a social community and everything. It was like they explicitly designed for each one of these 4 different character types, or player types, rather.
Yeah. That's interesting. I wonder if they built from that model.
It seems so intentional.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. Did you stick with it for a long time?
Not super long, so.
I'm curious, because that's tangential. We can talk about it afterwards.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, types of games, game platforms. So some of the more famous, Steam and XBLA, Xbox Live Arcade, publishing platforms. Steam in recent years has gotten a lot of good traction and press and whatnot because they've done a really good job of opening themselves up to indie devs being able to come in and just kind of put their own stuff on the store. Personally, I haven't done much with Steam or XBLA. Obviously, you guys know I'm an iOS developer, so it's where the majority of my experience has been on different like iOS and mobile platforms. And when I was working at EA and stuff, we did stuff on distributing directly in terms of application software and what have you. There's also consoles and handhelds that could not be very approachable to indie game developers. It's not to say that you can approach it, but it's harder. You need development kits, you need some hardware, things like that. It's a little bit trickier. Then distribution becomes a problem. You have to get somebody to actually fabricate your cartridge and whatever, CD-ROM, whatever we're on now, send it out there to people, all that sort of stuff. So those tend to be less approachable to indie developers. So, I mean, if you guys are interested, researching Steam or XBLA is very, very worth your time. I think Steam is probably the easiest to get up and going on because it's cross-platform, all that sort of stuff. It has some really interesting tools that you can use. But for this class, I'm going to be leaning on what I know best, which is iOS. So we're going to be looking at building an iOS game throughout the course of this class. So I'm really curious. This is kind of what I put together just as a starting point for us all to kind of launch in this little 1-month journey together. I'm kind of curious what people want to get out of this. I can see this going a couple different ways. I am prepared to essentially try to build a game throughout the course of the class that you guys can follow along with, chime in with, help me with the game design on. Or we could try doing more of a team broken out approach. I mean, what do you guys feel? Like, how hands-on do you want to be?
Very.
Very?
Yeah.
Very hands-on, okay.
Build our own games.
Excellent, excellent. So, let's see, do you want to build one game for the class? Do you want to break out to teams?
Teams.
Teams?
Yeah.
Okay.
My question too would be like, how many people can you have working on one fairly simple game?
Yeah.
Is that going to be, seems like you just end up stepping on each other's toes.
Scoping is going to be a problem, and this is why I was a little bit reluctant to immediately jump into this idea of groups and building games, because I don't know, maybe this is just me, but I find it to be kind of disheartening when I jump into a project, but then, halfway through realize it's way bigger than I thought it was going to be, and I'm not going to finish it, and it's going to be this half-baked thing that sits on my hard drive forever, and I'm going to go stash it on my server, and one day I'm going to remember it and be like, oh, so I don't want you guys to have that experience. So I'd like to try to find a way that we can actually effectively build a game, or 3 games, or 5 games, or whatever it is in this class. So,
Is it possible to maybe do both? Like maybe for the month, we all work as one big team to work on your game, and then afterwards maybe we break into teams, and then we consult back with you to based on what we did as a group with your app, maybe teams of 4 or 5 or whatever start doing different games, and then just touch back with you hey, remember that time we did this? How do we get past this obstacle? Maybe that's a option.
Okay. Yeah, well, how do you guys feel about that approach? So, I already had something in mind that I thought would be a good, well-scoped game that I had a rough sketch of it, essentially, to start with, that I was going to essentially build one way or another, just so people had something to compare it against what they were working on. I think you guys are still welcome to do your own groups throughout the course of the class, and I'll support you in whatever way I can. And then maybe those who feel more comfortable can work a little bit more directly with me, and we'll work on one class game. Does that sound like a reasonable approach? Yeah. Okay, cool. Oh, a couple more things just to get to the end of this little presentation. Modding. Does everybody know what modding is? Yeah? Modifying existing games, essentially. Modding for short. It's how a lot of, surprisingly large number of video game developers get their start. It's a cool pastime if you're into that sort of thing. If you've got a video game that you like a lot, especially if it's on Steam or something like that, you can actually, a lot of times, just kind of jump into what they're doing. Tweak some colors, tweak some rules. Sometimes they make it really easy for you. You don't even have to be a programmer a lot of times. Modding sometimes they give you a whole world editor, and you can build your own maps. Depends a lot on the game, but I guarantee you that if you search your game name plus modding, you'll probably find something interesting. And it's a great way to get your hands dirty and start playing around with game design without actually having to do tons of art and game design coding and blah, 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 blah. Really, a lot of people get their start this way. It's quite interesting. And there's also some games out there that were originally mods, just kind of grew upon themselves until they became their own games. Counter-Strike comes to mind. Was Half-Life 2. It was just modded to be a multiplayer game. And that's how Counter-Strike came to be. Portal, yeah, another great one.
Isn't Dota?
Dota. I was going to say Dota, but I wasn't sure how many people were going to know it. But yeah, Dota's a great mod.
What is that?
It's a mod on
Warcraft 3.
Warcraft 3 that they modded, right? Yeah. Where instead of being more army based, it's more based upon the hero and leveling up into more of an RPG instead of RTS. If that makes sense. Resources, if anybody is interested in this sort of stuff, kind of fun. Twitter, the hashtag GameDev. is pretty active. You'll see a lot of people posting there. I post there occasionally. Reddit r/GameDev is fun too. You'll see lots of people asking questions and whatnot. And there's a couple other linked Reddits there on the front page. Indie Game Movie is, as the name suggests, a movie about indie games, and is really kind of an interesting look, for better or for worse, at what it's like for the really serious indie game developers. I'll just throw it out there, this is why I don't do that full time. People get pretty into it to the extent that, like, okay, yeah, your life doesn't need to be completely wrapped up in building games, but it's a great movie. It's really fun to watch. Platformers were the type of game that I meant to mention as another example. Right. Does anybody play this game?
Is it Dingle Hop or something?
Oh, yeah.
Dingle Hop.
Dingle Hop.
Doodle Jump, yeah. Close. Yeah.
I played that one.
Yeah, it's a good game.
We can call ours Dingle Hop.
Single hop. The reason I like this game is because it's very simple in scope. Your objective is simply to get as high as you possibly can. Now,
I'm high.
well, that could be a mod. Yeah, right. To gain
played that in high
so in the upper left there, you have your score or your height, essentially, and the game gets harder the more altitude you gain. I'm going to be very careful for the rest of these three courses. Right. And as you can see, too, there starts to be some dynamic elements that come into play here. Those platforms where that you're looking at here, the players got into a fairly high altitude already. And there's, like, those brown platforms are kind of false friends, false platforms that'll break if he tries to jump on them.
And the green ones get you higher?
Yeah, so the green stuff gets you higher, yes. So the basic gameplay, you can it's probably like a 99-cent game, you can download it if you feel like it, is that you tilt the phone back and forth, and that controls the little dude as he floats across the screen, and he's constantly bouncing. So each time he hits a platform, he bounces a little higher, and if you miss a platform, you fall off the bottom of the screen, you die. It's a really simple, straightforward game, but you can see how these extra things start to come into play here. In the left screen, there's a monster that if he hits his head on that, he's going to die. There's a shield there that can protect him against the monster. There's different colors of platforms that do different things. So what I find really interesting about this game is that on the most basic level, you just stripping it all the way down, you could make it as just the platforms and the little dude. And you could make a fun game out of just that. I mean, it's not going to be the most fun game, it's not going to be as fun as this, but you could literally have lines for those solid platforms and a ball that you're trying to bounce as high as it can get. And that's kind of what I wanted to cover in the next class, is the formal elements of game design, how we can take that very, very simple structure and use mathematics, use game design principles to build a fun game. How, for example, the main topic of that discussion is going to be, how does difficulty relate to skill? So how does the game know that you're getting better, and how does it adjust its own internal mechanics so that the difficulty changes and it remains fun? And there's some pretty interesting, straightforward mathematical equations that actually can do that for you. It's pretty interesting. Right, so that's kind of like the basic idea that I thought might be an interesting game. Though I definitely want to open this up to a conversation. I don't want to dictate this or like come in and say that's what we're doing.
Do you ever think about who you want to build for before deciding what you're going to build?
It depends. I mean, I think that's entirely a valid approach. So the game that I've been working on now for quite some time was very intently for like I pitched it as Magic the Gathering meets Pokemon. I had the 8-year-old version of myself in mind when I came up with that. I'm like, I'm building for that kid, like whatever the 18-year-old or 18 years ago me sort of thing. And that he has been in my mind is like who I'm building for the whole thing. Other times, no. Other times it's more just kind of ad hoc, and I mean you have to have some impetuous. You can't just go slap things together. But what I do like to do personally is to take games that I know work well with what I want, like Doodle Jump here, and then figure out how I can adjust them for a different effect. So I'd love to hear some of the other game ideas that people have been thinking about or wanting to build themselves, though.
I have a game idea where you, each team has like a bunch of different pieces they can get, sort of like chess, except you have to order your pieces to move at the same time.
Okay.
So it's sort of like, it could be skilled, but it's also a bunch of randomness too. So you have like different pieces that move sort of like different chess pieces. You basically like try and move and take over the board over time.
Interesting. So are you saying that the 2 turns are concurrent?
At the same time. So you plan your move, they plan their move, and you just go.
Okay, so like, as I'm planning my move, you're planning your move, and I don't get to see your move until I've made my move, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, boom, we see both moves on the board. Interesting. So, another buzz phrase within the industry is hidden information, and you'd be playing with a lot of hidden information in that sort of game, where you don't know. I think you would see some interesting fallout as compared to something like chess, where instead of being strictly reactionary, you're going to be more anticipatory. You're going to be playing on the notion of like, what do I know about this person, what he might be thinking, rather than what did he just do?
Yeah. Have you ever played this game, like this drinking game where you just like have to say at the same time like 1 or 2?
Yeah.
You guys know this one? Yeah, well, it's sort of like the same thing like that. It's like like you can play with your little cousins if they're like 5 years old because it's like
A drinking game for little cousins?
I mean, I don't know.
And you can play the game where you get really high.
Yeah.
Moral of the story: game designers are drugs.
There's a board game that I've played that's like this sort of. It's called Field Command, and you issue like 10 commands at once on both sides, and then like execute all the moves.
But I think it would be really suited for like a computer, this one, because then you don't have to manually resolve it. Like it can automatically faster.
Have you given any thought to like the different types of pieces you might have, or how the board might be structured, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, you could have different structured boards. I think you could have basically like field of vision for your pieces and what you see of the board. And you have different like points. If you capture points, you get more vision. And you have different pieces, different values that cost different amounts, and depending on how much territory you can like send them in the back. It's sort of like Stratego, sort of like chess.
Sounds like you're talking about like a fog of war mechanic.
Yeah.
Okay. Does everybody know what fog of war is? No. It's so presumably the battlefield's this big, but you can only see where your units are, and everything else is shrouded in a fog of war. So only by having army presence in the area does it give you the ability to know what's happening in that area. It's something that Warcraft does, Starcraft does. It's pretty interesting. It has consequences because if with Shroud of War, or Fog of War, sorry, if the opponent does something and is way better than you, you can get completely blindsided. This is why in StarCraft, you might be playing along for 8 minutes and all of a sudden somebody Zerg rushes you and you're just like, whoa, where did that come from? I had no idea what was happening, and now I have no idea how he did it. So that can be the negative side, but on the positive side, it has a sense of kind of realism to it, a sense of like intrigue and a sense of exploration and capturing and such. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Another one I thought of is, what's it called now? Kind of like Simon Says, but it's, I remember having one when I was a little kid. It's like 4 buttons. It's like a physical little machine, and it does a pattern, and then there's colors, and then you have to repeat it.
Okay.
But I think on a phone that'd be pretty fun.
Okay, yeah.
I forget, it's kind of like Simon Says, because it's like you repeat whatever the person does, but it's a game. And forget the name now.
Simon.
Is it Simon, just Simon?
Yeah.
Oh, the round thing with the 4 colors?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah. But I think it'd be pretty fun and addictive on a phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might be able to even leverage some interesting mechanics where instead of just like remembering what to touch, it might be like a shake, like a, you know,
Like pop it.
Pop it.
yeah.
So let's make it really annoying too.
If you ever see somebody at the boss be like, then you know what game they're playing.
Have you played Space Team?
No, I haven't.
Oh, that's
Anybody
so
else?
cool.
It's like the best fun game I've played. It's amazing.
Space Team?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll check that out.
It's like, I don't know, it's like that in that you use a lot of different, like you like wipe things off on the screen and you shake and you like, you flip the phone upside down.
Yeah.
But the game mechanic is pretty interesting. Like,
And it's multiplayer.
it's a multiplayer, it's a team-based game. The
Oh, so
idea
yeah.
is that you're all in a spaceship that's like falling apart and that you need to keep together to like, whatever, escape from dying. And everybody has instructions on their screen
Yeah.
for controls or like things to do.
Okay.
And everybody else has their own control panel, and so you have to like yell out the instructions, and you don't know who has what controls. You
Interesting.
have to, like tell each other to do it. Yeah. So sometimes you'll get an instruction that you can like perform, but sometimes somebody else has to do it. So it's interesting. We shall play it as part of this class.
Yeah. I would be down for that. Some do a little multiplayer game sessions as a class.
Yeah.
Space Team was called?
Space Team.
Yeah. Does anybody else have a game they wanted to pitch? Oh, did you have
Sorry, I got dragged into something.
Oh, man. Do you want to do a pitch at another time then?
Sure.
Okay.
I think of something.
Do you have a game idea?
No.
No, okay.
But I can come up with something if you really want.
Well, you just seemed like you're really eager to want to.
I
break
am
up
eager, yeah. I was wondering if you could start us out with like a hello world or something of that nature to get us dirty in the means to the second way.
Oh, to like start the project or
Yeah.
anything? Yeah, I mean, I can run you guys through just kind of like how Cooking 2D works real quick and for the programmers in the group.
Sure.
So, if we go ahead, if you have Cocos 2D installed already, and you open up Xcode and you create a new project, which is what I just did real quickly there, you will find in your menus there are new features accessible. So iOS and OS X both have Cocos 2D as a project template for you there. Wait a second to catch up.
So this is just in create a new project.
Yep.
I see.
Found it? Cool. All right, so I'm going to call this, so I had this idea for the dramatic element of this game that I was thinking of building for the class. I thought it would be kind of fun if we combined, did anybody ever read the children's book, The Little Prince?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
My favorite book.
It's your favorite book? I love it too. It's an awesomely like ephemeral story, and it feels very like, for some reason it struck me that it'd be kind of fun if the little guy jumping around was jumping from planet to planet, and he was the little prince, like going through space or something. Oh, that actually reminds me of part of the reason I thought of that was if anybody has ever seen this game, it's very similar to Doodle Jump actually, and I really like the aesthetic and the kind of pleasant. My computer's lagging like because of the video and everything. It's actually incredibly fun to play, and I'm having a hard time not stopping playing even though I'm talking right now. But anyway, so that's the basic idea there. It's very much the same mechanic as Doodle Jump, just implemented on a desktop instead.
What was that called?
It's called Winter Bells. So when I saw Doodle Jump and I saw that, I thought it would be kind of cool to take that sort of like ephemeral, nice, spacey sort of feel that you get from Winter Bells, and combine that with the nice interactive elements of the iPhone, like moving and tilting and all that sort of stuff, and then layer on this like childhood memory for a lot of us of The Little Prince. So that's kind of the direction I thought I'd try to go with it. So we'll see. This might evolve through the class. I don't want to, like, again, I don't want to dictate, but yeah, that's one idea I had of something that's pretty accomplishable in 4 weeks. So anyway, I brought that up because I needed a name for the project, so I'm just going to call it Little Planet Prince. Go ahead and create the project here.
What's the difference between these two templates? One that had like Newtonian or something?
Oh yeah. What were they two called again? One's Newton and one's what?
iOS.
Yeah, just.
One's iOS.
Oh, yeah. Newton is a physics engine, which does everybody know what a physics engine is? No. So a physics engine will do things for you like collision detection and things that like bouncing off of each other. And for example, if you were building Angry Birds, I would highly, highly recommend you use it because it is a physics engine that's going to be able to do things like you're going to say, hey, this ball hit the building, and instead of you having to do things like tilts and rotations and figuring all that out, it'll just be like, okay, yeah, and this bounced this way and blah, 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 and it'll just handle it for you.
So is there any reason to start a project without that?
Yes, I won't be using it because it's for very basic sort of stuff, like a platformer like this.
Yeah.
I'm going to do my own collision detection. In fact, it might even be tricky to use Newton because you want to be able to come up through underneath the platforms and then land back on the platforms. So it's, I think actually I'm not going to use it.
So it's more for like very realistic.
Yeah.
type things.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like, if the physics of the game scares you, then use it. If you feel like you can do the physics pretty logically without that, then don't bother. Cool. All right, so we got this this project that started up already, and I'm just going to go ahead and run it and see what happens. It's been a while since I've downloaded the latest version of Cocos 2D. I just downloaded it today. The game I've been working on for 7 months now, 8 months now, is obviously using a pretty outdated version, so we shall see what happens. I guess they're on V3 now, fun times. Right, so we have a little Hello World screen that pops up for us here. This is like their old tutorials. Yeah. So it shows you a little sprite action. So I guess some words about nomenclature. In 2D games, so Cocos 2D is a 2D game engine. You can't do anything 3D with this, so sorry if you wanted to go build some huge 3D world. But it does 2D games very, very well. And in 2D games, we have this concept of sprites. Sprites are just simple flat assets, really. They can be animated, so you might have something that is a composite of multiple different sprites moving through multiple different frames in order to get the effect of a dude running along the screen. So sprites are essentially your building block for just about anything in the game. In Cocos 2D, the naming convention they use, if everybody's familiar with iOS, you probably know that there's these 2 letters that start, it's kind of our pseudo namespacing in iOS, where in the Airbnb project we have 2 letters that prefix every class. In this case we have CC that prefixes everything that's coming through Cocos. So CC scene, I guess I didn't plan on doing a Cocos tutorial right now, so maybe I should think through how I'm going to say this. On a high level, we have the scenes. You're just like in a movie, you're always looking at one scene, no more than one. You might replace the scene to be something else. So you might have a menu scene and a gameplay scene. And the scene is whichever one you're currently looking at. Within a scene, you might have multiple layers. Layers are just ways to stack things on top of each other, much like layers in Photoshop. You don't, for example, want the HUD, or heads-up display, showing underneath the character. You want the HUD above the character. So if you create a HUD layer, and you create a character layer, and you create a background layer, then you know that anything that's in the background, you put into the background layer. Anything that's in the character layer, or anything that's a character, you put in the character layer. Anything that's in the HUD, you put in the HUD layer. Just a way of kind of putting the things in different orders. You can also assign explicit z-indexes to things in Cocos 2D. So anything that is added as a child can have a z-index. You can say, You know, the HUD layer is z index 10, a character layer is z index 5, the background is z index 0. Just guarantees for you that, you know, that's where they're at. Then later, if you want to insert one at z index 3, you know that it'll be between the character and the background. If you don't explicitly define a z index, it'll just kind of stack them on top of each other. So it's optional. If you've done iOS coding before, you're probably familiar with stuff like UI kit and things like that. The naming is a little bit different here in Cocos 2D land, but it's still fairly similar. I'm just poking around the code here, and let's see what we got. Cool. So add child. That's pretty much anything can have a child added to it in Cocos 2D. So you can see some different instantiations of different object types in here. So let me poke around this code. I haven't looked at it beforehand and make sure that I understand what's going on here. So this intro scene here is directly correlating to this scene. So we've got hello world showing up here on the screen. It's defining a font name, it's using a label, hello world, chalk duster is that font you see there, and boom, we have a red bit of text. Pretty simple. Okay, so some thoughts too about the other key properties you might want to be aware of with Cocos 2D objects. Aside from our methods for adding children and stuff, we also have color is pretty typical, which is of its own special Cocos 2D type. We have position, which is just where it is on the screen. It looks like they might have changed something in this version of Cocos 2D. Classically, there's also been this notion of anchor point, where an anchor point is from 0 to 1, and it tells you where within the bounds of the object, relatively speaking, like this anchor is. So in other words, if I put the anchor point at 0.5, the anchor is right in the middle of whatever object. Now, if I set the position of the object, the position is based upon where the anchor is. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. I wasn't sure if I explained that well or not. And that, also, one other little gotcha for programmers out there. In programming land, or in video game land, Y is 0 on the bottom and goes higher, as opposed to inverted in typical iPhone development. So you have to think in typical, normal, plain old Cartesian coordinates for game programming, which is good because when you're doing physics, you want negative to mean down. At least in my mind, it makes a little bit more sense.
Is that why they did that?
Yeah. Yeah, because your code would get super unreadable if you were like, wait, what? Why is that positive and going negative? I don't get it. Yeah. When you're writing physics equations, it would look really ugly. Plus, that's how the whole video game industry does it. So it made more sense to conform to the video game industry when they wrote Cocos 2D than it did to conform to whatever else. Oh, interesting thing about Cocos 2D too is it's cross-platform, so you don't have to do it on iOS. I think they have an Android version and such as well. I think. Could be wrong. So we started this talk with sprites, which is that's another type of object. This little asset in the middle of the screen is sprite. He's got an animation playing on him right now that's a spinning animation. Let's see. I wonder where that code is coming from. Yeah, there we go. So you can see how that sprite is being created in the Hello World scene. CC sprite with image named icon72.ping. So that initiates the sprite. Then it gets set at a position, and then it gets added to the scene, and then a rotation action is created, and that action is repeated forever. And that's how he's doing that little spin guy. I think most of you can probably poke through this code and start to make some pretty good sense of it by yourselves without me kind of walking through every little piece. So something I think that might be interesting to understand how sprites end up playing in larger games is to have a look at, here's a sprite sheet from one of my games, where you can see the different dialogues and different pieces of UI. So once you start to build things together, it doesn't make sense to have a billion little assets. In fact, it becomes really non-performant in the game. So you can use programs like this, which allow you to just take those different pings and put them into a sprite sheet. Here's another one where now that however many 100 assets I have in there are all in one big sheet that I can then essentially reference. And even more interestingly, you get stuff like if you want to animate a character, you can move him through. You can see that he has different movements within the sheet. So it's actually different frames, like frames of a movie, that get played. So that's essentially the conceptual or visual representation behind how you do that sort of thing. Cocos TD understands this idea of animations. You'll say this animation involves this 6 frames. Then you'll just say, hey, play the animation, and it'll do it for you. So by the time you get all the assets prepared and everything, it's really just like 2 lines of code. It's pretty cool. Yeah. Any questions? Anybody curious about anything in particular with Cocos TD? Cool. All right. Well, here's my plan, at least. I'm going to set up my project over the next week and kind of put some basic things together and prepare for the next class, so that I can, be at the point where we can actually look at the construction of the game, and we can do some really simple rectangle and sphere sort of game design and play around with it that way. And then I would love to have you guys come bring your ideas to the class, and don't let anything I've said about the game itself be the final word. I'd love to be challenged. I'd love for us to be a collaborative effort. And also, we heard a couple pitches here on game design. If you guys want to join up in teams, if you guys want to do that sort of thing, I would love to see that happen as well, and I will give you whatever support I can. I have limited time for the actual coding aspect, but I can definitely give whatever advice I possibly can. So over the course of the next 3 weeks, we're going to have a class on the formal, the dynamic, and the dramatic. So what we're going to see happen is next week will be the balls and rectangles or whatever, different little polygons, and we'll just see the little ball bouncing up and